in a very specific place in your business right now. Revenue is happening, customers are buying, and the brands have traction. But something does not feel right possibly with your business at the moment, where margins are tighter than you could ever expected, or cash feels more constrained than you ever expected, or inventory feels heavier than it should have. And every season starts to feel a little more complex, a little more reactive. Does that sound familiar? If it is, you are in the right place, and welcome to Path to Profit with Yay. It's a series of live webinars complementing to our roundtables that happens every Tuesday, first Tuesday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as well as the Path to Profit every third Thursday of the month at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And if you are here, a couple of the things that you might be asking yourself, how am I and where am I really leaking margin? And why am I not as profitable as I think I should be? And every season, as it starts to feel more complex, you are potentially your team starts to be more and more reactive by treating symptoms versus finding the root cause and actually addressing it. If that's where you are, you're not alone. This is actually one of the most predictable phases in the fashion and product businesses because what's happening is really not random. You are not dealing with an isolated issue. You're dealing with a structural problem inside the operating system of the business. And that's the shift I want you to make today. Because most companies really try to fix pricing, inventory, and suppliers, but those all are truly are symptoms of a one major potential root cause or root problem. And the real issue is, and usually always lays behind the system, the product that was never designed to support the level of scale that you might be experiencing at the moment. And what that creates is margin leaks. Not one big leak, but dozens of small ones. Freight assumptions that are slightly off. MOQ decisions that look logical but create inventory risks. Return drivers that are misunderstood and really keep reacting to it. Individually, they all seem negligible, but collectively, they all quietly erode your profitability. And as we are really kind of looking at, going into thinking, how do we find where those profit leaks are? And what is it that we actually need to do in order for us to be aware of where to even look, or how do we even solve for things like this? One of the things that we are going to kind of talk about today is how do you run a profit leak audit within your company, right? To really understand, and instead of really start saying, I think there is where we lose money today, I'm hoping you're going to leave with, I know exactly where the margin is slipping, how much it's costing us, and where to fix first. But before we get into today's session, I want to take a moment to introduce myself to those especially who are joining us for the first time. And whether you're watching this live or are watching our recordings after the session, please, first, I'd love to let you guys know is that we are taking really diligently, making sure that we respond to everyone's questions. So if you are watching this live, please feel free to drop comments. I am watching the feed. I will be responding to the questions as they come in. And if you are watching this as a recorded session, then feel free to also drop the comments in the event session or where you are actually watching the recording, and we will address them. It's important for us to know that we are driving value, that we are delivering the tangible results and helping you to succeed within your business. So feel free to drop comments, share this content. We're always super excited to hear from you and be able to help. But for those who do not know who I am, my name is Evgenia Alexandrovna Yushkova, or simply Yay. And I'm a fashion business strategist and operate architect, where my team and I, we really do help to design and transform the systems behind the product businesses, especially the parts that actually drive profitability. So, merchandising strategies, assortment architecture, inventory economics, supply chain design, and the internal process that connects all of that. I've worked across both manufacturing side and the retail side of the industry, building private label divisions for large retailers, restructuring assortments, redesigning supply chain, and helping brands move from reactive growth to structured, profitable scaling. And the reason I focus this session today is because I kept seeing the same pattern across a lot of our clients. Companies did not struggle because they had bad products. They've struggled because the systems behind those products wasn't built to support the growth. Many of my clients often ask, why are we growing, but it's not translating into a strong profitability? And that is why they turn often to us, not to fix one issue, but to help them step back and diagnose the system. Because what looks like a pricing issue or supplier issue or inventory issue, it's almost always part of a big structural misalignment. So, the way we will work with the companies in today's environment, we always take two-step approach. First, we run the structural diagnostics, where we look at where the margins is actually leaking, how inventory is performing, how the supply chain is structured, and where the operational friction is costing you money. And then from there, we redesign the revenue engine, which includes the assortment restructuring, inventory and buying planning, open to buy planning, supply chain transformation, and most importantly, the process architecture. We want to make sure we optimize the process in the way we eliminate waste. Not only waste in inventory and an actual product, physical product, but the waste among the steps that are taking in to actually move that product forward to your consumer. So the business that can scale without breaking and without losing the margin, it helps us to then build a foundation to ensure that they are able to scale and grow sustainably. And the reason I'm telling you all of this up front is because today's sessions is really essential to consider really a version of how you are going to think moving forward about your business. You're going to walk away with a profit leak audit that you could be able to implement today within your organization. So instead of guessing where the margins might be slipping, you can start seeing where it actually is and why is it actually happening and what needs to be fixed first. Now let's start with something that sounds simple, but is one of the biggest sources of hidden margin erosion in most businesses that we interact with. One of the most important critical things is to look at is the landed cost models. To be direct with you guys, a lot of the times when we get to kind of start looking at the costing and analyzing the landed costs, most brands do not have the true landed cost models. They really have what we call them is blended estimates. And that's a big problem because your landed cost is not just a product cost plus freight. It's full economic structure that includes freight vitality, duty classifications, port fees, timing, import handling, and operational inefficiencies in between. And here's where things starts to break. When your landed cost is slightly off, when we are so heavily relying on estimates and so rarely to going back in and actually fine-tuning and understanding what our true costs are. Your pricing starts to be off if your landed costs are just based on estimates. Your margin expectations are off, and your buying decisions are off. And now the entire system is misaligned. We have seen brands lose 3 to 5 margin points without realizing it, just from incorrect freight and duty assumptions. And the dangerous part of all, that if you don't feel it immediately and you feel it much later, when the cash starts to be much more tighter, and when markdown starts to increase, and when your next buys really gets to more of a constraints. If you're operating at scale, your questions really should never be, or no longer is, what does this cost? Your question really needs to become, what is the range of possible outcomes and how does that impact the margin? Because advanced operators don't work off of static numbers. They work off of scenarios. If my freight shifts, what happens to the margin? If duty changes, what happens to the pricing? If lead time expands, what happens to the cash flow? Are you guys asking those questions? And are you guys playing those scenarios within your organizations? Sam, thank you for asking a question. I appreciate the questions to start coming in. And really, please do send your questions in. It really helps us to understand that you guys are listening and this is helping. And it getting you to think about how to operate that within your own business or how to apply that to your business. So Sam, thank you for your question. Sam is asking if we already get freight quotes. Why isn't that enough? Well, the reason why the freight quotes is not potentially just enough, and it's a good beginning, and that's where it starts. But because the quotes is really capturing the moment in time, right? Where your business runs across time. If your model does not really account for variability or what could happen from time to time and how it will vary from your initial quote, you're building a decision on unstable inputs. And if you are able to get quotes, then try to ensure that you lock them in and you lock them in for a definite period of time that you could be able to then go back and retrack and recalculate to ensure that once the change happens, it actually takes into account and not wait till your season is over to understand what actually happened and where did you bleed the margin. Thank you for thumbs up, Sam. I'm glad that this was helpful. Mary, thank you for asking a question. How detailed should our landed cost model actually be? It really needs to be detailed enough that you can trust your margins at the SKU level. If you can't clearly say this product generates X profit after all the variable costs, then you probably don't have the decision grade visibility yet. You need to be able to ensure and create the models and create an ability to track it down to the SKU level, to track it down to each of the cycles of production that came in, so that you could be able to really constantly change your weighted averages of your landed cost to ensure that you are making up for the loss margin if such presents. And if you are not a huge company yet, it and you're wondering if this level of modeling really matters, it really does. And the sooner you start looking at it in much granular way, the more accurate you will be and will be protecting yourself from losing that margin over time later on. Because you especially when you're a smaller brand, do not have as much of the margin cushion. And a 2 to 3% leak in your business is really not going to become a theoretical problem. It will actually impact your survival impact and survival mode of whether you could be able to actually make it and be profitable or lose the business over time. So the smaller the business are, the more even critical it is to granularly track as anywhere you can. And now, even if your landed cost was perfect, there's another place where margin quietly disappears. And that's not in the cost modeling. It's really in how you commit to the inventory. Let's talk a little bit about MOQs, minimum or order quantities. Most companies treat MOQs as really a supplier rule, something that is fixed, something that is not negotiable, but that's not actually what MOQ is. MOQ is a risk allocation mechanism. And when you accept it blindly, you're really the one who's taking all the risks, not the supplier. So in reality, you increase your units to hit the MOQ. Your cost per unit, potentially, yes, it will improve. On paper, it looks like it's a good decision. But what actually happens? You are now holding more inventory than the new demand justifies. That inventory sits longer, it requires markdowns, and it ties up your cash. And suddenly, your cost savings became actually a margin loss. The most important thing is to shift how we look at the MOQs. Stop evaluating MOQs at the unit level and start evaluating it at the system level. Because MOQs impact cash flow, inventory turnover, markdown exposure, and ability to chase your demand. When we are working with our clients, we don't just negotiate MOQ, we are restructuring it. We look at the fabric commitments instead of finished good commitments. We're looking at the phased production approach. We look at the SKU consolidations. And we're also looking at the vendor relationships and improving those vendor relationships over time and building out that trust so that they could work with us on lowering the MOQs when needed, especially. We don't negotiate all MOQs across the border, but we strategically negotiate them in a way where we're able to maximize our profitability and lowering our costs, but at the same time releasing the amount of pressure and risk of having too much excess inventory and tying up our cash for too long. Because the goal is not just to lower the MOQ in this case, but the goal is to really protect the margin and preserve the flexibility. One of the questions we often ask, what if the supplier refuses to lower MOQ? And that's a really good question, because the often is the reason why they would refuse to lower MOQ because you potentially might not fully understand what their MOQ really ties in with. Whether it ties in with the production space or production capacity allocation, or whether it ties up with the fabric commitment that they need to have upfront in order for them to be able to have the dye lots and have the colors that you need. Or potentially it's the gray goods shortages, and that's why they need higher MOQs to be able to ensure that they have enough gray goods. Then when you really start to thinking about how do we lower those MOQs or how do we work with those suppliers, is we start to ask the right questions. The first questions we always ask is to truly understand what actually impacts their MOQ requirement. What is it actually impacting? And then we try to solve on those levels instead of trying to then putting more styles or more units into a particular style to meet the MOQ. We pivot the conversation of, hey, can we commit to a particular fabric MOQ and lower our risk of commitment because we do not have a finished product on hand, but we have fabric that we could use for this product as well as for chase, as well as later on we can repurpose it in other styles or programs. And then if it has to do with the production capacity or the sewing labor capacity, that's when we start to think about, can we combine some SKUs? Can we shift the commitments, to a different type of materials? Or can we adjust some of the colorways or find a ways where we can actually combine and bulk program the styles so that we could be able to meet their factory production MOQs, if that's really relates to this space. Sam, thank you for asking. Thank you for asking your questions. They're really, really great questions. How do we balance MOQ with the price breaks? Well, this is where a lot of the brands get really misled, right? They chase the lower cost per unit and they ignore the cost of unsold inventory. You don't optimize for the cost. You're really optimizing for the realized margin. So have to ensure that when you are starting to look at those price breakpoints and making decision at which ones you're going to bring in this particular product or this particular season of the product, you start to think about the risk, right? Which one has the lowest risk? Which you, by you increasing the quantities, you are still know that you'll be able to sell it based on your demand, because this is your bread and butter items, and it's your 20% that drives 80% of your revenue, versus figuring out how do I potentially take some margin hit, but work on the lower risk of higher inventory commitments to a test SKUs, right? Or to our new styles. And how can I set it up in the way where I can chase it? So potentially is where you can have the commitment of the fabric and commitment of the colors and have that in stock, so that you can shorten your chase time and then be able to then chase it in smaller quantities at the beginning. And then once you see the style is proven and has a good sell-through and demand, that's when you go into increasing your MOQ, increasing your orders to be able to get those price breaks. But you don't want to do that from day one, even though it might sound really appealing. And how do we also think we have to consistently think, if not, how to protect ourselves from overbuying? Because if your business consistently relies on markdowns to clear your inventory, you're really not buying based on your demand. You are really buying based on your constraints. And you're putting in extra pressure not only on your profitability, but you're also putting extra pressure on your teams, starting from marketing to merchandising team and all the way down to your sales teams, to be able to figure out how to get rid of this inventory that you brought in that you are now sitting on top. Inventory is absolutely not something that you need to be proud of to hold on for a long time, because at the end of the day, it ties up your cash. And the more optimized inventory levels you have and be able to have easy capabilities of actually chasing on demand is where the critical balance is between the optimal way of running a business versus putting yourself in the danger zone of leaking the profits and leaking your margins. Now that the next step that we are moving forward to is to really think about the most extensive leaks for that happens within the most brands and categories, and also they often the ones that are the most misunderstood is the returns. Let's frame the returns for a second, right? Returns are not just the customer issues; they are our system failure signals. And most companies track returns, but they don't really diagnose them. Most brands really are looking at what is the percentage of your return rate, right? Which is, let's say, 20%, 15%, depending on which product category you are. You might have a higher rates and might have a lower rates, even in comparison to what the industry standards are. But the numbers really does not help you in this case, because they really don't tell you what to fix. They're just telling you that you have a high return rate. So what we often do is we making sure that we embed the system of the way that your return process set up, so that you can actually break the returns into root causes to identify what the real cause of the returns is. And for some products, even within your own assortment, you will notice that some products will actually have one return issue, while the other products have a completely different return issue. And those are, again, helping you to identify what the root causes are to start solving them. They're not always going to be returning for the same exact reason across the border. It happens, but that's not always the case. And so, really looking at not just the surface level reasons of returning, we actually help to dive in and identify the fit inconsistency, fabric expectations, or whether it's the fabric mismatch, or whether it's the image mismatch to what the product has actually been received and how the customer perceived it, the quality issues, the shipping damages, the product misrepresentation, because each of one of those requires a complete different fix. And understanding which one it is extremely critical and important. If you don't isolate really the drivers, you will keep solving the wrong problems and the leak will continue. But should you address your high return rates? Absolutely, because this is one of the number one low hanging fruit of where you could be able to pick up margin and profitability by reducing that return rate. But to do that, you need to understand and have a clear feedback, customer feedback loop created, and as well as a system and mechanism of collecting the proper return reasons, and find a way of how the customers actually would give you those reasons versus just marking it, oh, I don't want this item, or I don't like this item, or be very generic or specific, not specific, because at the end of the day, it does not help you if you do not really understand what the real root cause of your returns are. And returns are really not just the cost that's refunds when we start looking at the P&L level, right? They're the costs that really reverse your logistics. They are how, income making a more complex inventory handling, which results in cost as well. Loss of full price sale, and then also potential write-offs if you think about it. But also think about the resources and the time, the wasted time that takes to reprocess the return, to reevaluate whether this product can go back on shelf, and putting it back on shelf, and then the postage that goes back and forth. I mean, all of those are contributing to for you to leak the margin. And if you're not tracking that on the SKU level, then how can you really tell whether this particular style is profitable or not in the long run? And if really margin impact is really significantly higher than most teams models, then you are really need to start thinking about how we're going to address and how we're going to solve it for it. A lot of our clients come to us and let us know, well, we're already tracking the returns. Why is this not enough? And it's really because the customer selected reasons are often inaccurate. And you need to really validate against the product batch supplier data and really where the truth shows up, right? You really need to really dive deeper and understand where the true issues are. A lot of the times, the return reasons by the customers is just an initial signal. And instead of just jumping on and trying to solve for it, you got to first take a step back and really reevaluate and understand where the problem actually is. Even if it takes you sometimes to become your own customer and become your own blind customer, and to see what the experience you've had with that particular product, to validate some of those comments, to validate some of those returns reasons, to identify which one is the real true root cause of your return. Thank you for bringing in the questions. I really appreciate that they're trickling in. It's really great to see when we are having an engagement conversation. So thank you for everyone who's sending it in. The question just came in, what's the fastest way to reduce returns? The fastest way is to really not to try to fix everything. Fix the highest financial drivers first, right? So find the SKUs, find the issues, or styles that have the highest return rate, and see which ones actually are financially impacting your profitability, the bottom line, the most. If you are chasing a tail style that is already not part of your 20% that drives 80% of your revenue, and it's somewhere long down the tail and has a high return rate compared to the style that is one of your 20% that drives 80% of your revenue, styles that has high return rate, well, which one do you need to address first? Obviously, the one that brings you the most revenue, and leave the tail for later on, and potentially even reevaluate whether you even need this tail, or can you chop it off and create your assortment in more optimal way so it really focuses on your core, and then solve for those problems. So prioritization is also really incredibly important when we're dealing with trying to solve the problems and identifying where we actually need to put our attention at this given moment. And so now that we've identified the kind of leaks across costs, inventory decisions, and returns, the question becomes is where do we actually start? What do we do with this now that we've identified this, or we at least identified the areas where we could potentially look? And this is where a lot of the times our clients get stuck to trying to understand is where do we start? How do we do this? They've identified the problems that they know that they can feel that the margin is leaking. They know that they can see the inventory is too heavy. They know that the returns are too high, and they know the suppliers' turns are working against them. But then what really happens next? The conversation stays at the level of awareness. They have meetings over meetings with team members and with their stakeholders, but yet there's no really tangible result that come out of those long meetings. Everybody agrees that there is a problem. Everybody agrees that something needs to be improved. Everybody leaves that meeting with a good intention, and then nothing materialistically changes. Why does this happen? Well, this happens because the business never translates those issues into executional frameworks. And this is such an important point, especially for more advanced companies who are already at that scale and who are growing, is to understand that the awareness is not really going to recover your margin. The insight does not recover your margin. A list of problem will also not recover your margin. What recovers the margin is a system that takes what you found and converts it into an action, accountability, and measurable financial impact. So when we talk about a margin recovery roadmap, what we are really talking about is how do you take a business that has a hidden leaks across pricing, sourcing, inventory, freight, returns, and internal execution, and turn that into a prioritized plan that actually improves profit. That is where the roadmap really matters. Because if you do not have that roadmap, you have only thing that you really have is diagnosis. And diagnosis without execution is just another version of delay. So let's break down what the real margin recovery roadmap actually requires. So, step one is we want to quantify. The first step is really going to be important to understand and quantify the leak itself. And this is where I want to be very clear. You cannot prioritize what you have, not translate it into dollars, not percentages, not broad statements, not I think the freight is too high, or not I think that the returns potentially hurting us, or inventory seems heavy. That's really not enough. What you really need is how much is it costing us? And if you are in the position where you're trying to convince your stakeholders to really pay attention to this particular problem, well, quantify it in actual costs, and then bring that to the table. It will pivot the conversation and how that awareness of this problem will be perceived in a very different way. Because when we talk about dollars, dollars create clarity for us, right? And for any business owner or a business operator, we all want to talk about understanding how that impacts our bottom line profitability and how much is it actually costing us. And often teams bring these problems without really having a number next to it. And this is why often it's being either dismissed or not taken seriously, because there's really no tangible number that associate with it. And clarity changes the quality of the decision making once you understand the financial impact, once it actually turns into dollars. For example, if one team says freight is a problem and another team says returns are the bigger issue, well, and someone else says markdowns is a real problem where it's actually causing you leaks, well, you can really stay either stuck to that opinion for a very long time, or you can say whether the freight variances is costing you $1,800,000 as an example, right? Or returns tied into a fit consistency are costing you 240,000 annually. or overbuying at lower productivity SKUs is locking in $400,000 of working capital. Now the conversation really changes, because now you're no longer debating based on noise, you're making decisions based on the financial weight. And this matters because not every margin leaks deserves equal attention. Some leaks are really just annoying, but they are part of having and doing business, especially within this product's phase. Some leaks are very expensive, and some leaks are structurally dangerous. You need to know the difference. So when you are quantifying it, you're looking at the questions like, what is the annualized dollar loss? What is the impact on the gross margin? What is the impact on the working capital? What is the impact on the cash conversions? And what is the downstream impact on markdowns, missed sales, or planning distortions? Because sometimes the leak is not just the direct cost. Sometimes the real damage is what that leak creates down the stream. The bad minimum order quantity decision is not just an inventory issue, it becomes a cash issue. Then it becomes a markdown issue, then it becomes a planning issue, and then it water slides or cascades. Then it can really constrains your next season altogether. So in our first step to really trying to address this problem is we need to be able to not just the label or not just to identify the leak, but really also to size it, right? To help you to figure it out how much actually it's going to cost or it's costing you. And then you can so you can prioritize it. And so that you can lead with more precision. So now that we know the cost of it, we have to prioritize it. And then the prioritization is a very important tool and a very important step that often is missed when we're trying to run at 100 miles an hour and treating symptom after symptom. And this is where the leadership discipline really becomes critical. What the instinct of many companies is to fix everything at once. And the smaller the company is, then more chances of it where they will try to address everything at once. They come out of the audit really energized. They're ready to fix, they're ready to rock and roll. They see multiple issues, and suddenly everything function is trying to launch improvements, initiatives all at the same time. And this is where the thing starts to break. How many times you've gone through your process of trying to fix something, and all of a sudden there are too many cooks in the kitchen, and there are too many things that are starting to break, and more issues arise and more conflicts arise across departments. And at the end of the day, nothing is fixed. And slowly that issue just kind of gets swept under the rug until it reveals itself all over again. This happens on a daily basis in every organization. Let's face it. And that usually creates more noise, more complexity, and very little actual recovery. So instead of what you want to strategically is to prioritize. Not everything gets fixed at once. Not every leak deserves immediate attention. And not every issue should become a major project. The goal is to identify the changes that create the fastest and most meaningful financial recovery with reasonable implementation effort. This is a sweet spot, high impact, reasonable effort, because those are the changes that create the momentum. And the momentum really matters in our business. When the team starts seeing actual recovered dollars, improved margins, low return rates, and cleaner inventory and better cash flow, they become much more committed to the discipline required for the deeper transformation. So when you prioritize, you're really asking which issue is costing us the most? Which issue is the easiest to correct? Which issue has the biggest ripple effect across the business? Which issue improves both margin and operational stability? And which issues unlocks flexibility for the future decisions? For example, a return problem caused by inaccurate product page expectations may be easier and faster to address than a full vendor network redesign. A SKU rationalization project may unlock faster margin improvements than a major system implementation. A freight modeling correction may immediately improve pricing discipline and buying accuracy. So the prioritization is not just about what is wrong, it's about where the intervention creates the strongest return. And one thing I want to really emphasize here is that the advanced companies do not just prioritize by urgency, they prioritize by the economic leverage. Because most issues feel urgent but have limited financial impact. And most issues do not feel dramatically day to day, but they're quietly draining the business every single month. Your roadmap has a separate noise from the leverage. This is where the executive judgments really comes in. The next step really is going to be the ownership. And this is where many margin improvement efforts really fail because everybody says margin matters, but nobody really owns the actual recovery. And that's really a problem. Margin improvement does not happen at the company level in some vague shared way. It happens really at the functional level. It happens when a specific people own specific levers. Someone owns freight assumptions, someone owns vendor negotiation strategies, and someone owns return reductions. Someone owns inventory health, and someone else might own a SKU productivity review. And someone owns the process compliances, as well as someone owns pricing discipline. Without ownership, you are just have discussions and the discussions do not create operating change. Now, this does not mean one person carries the whole burden. What it really means is that each margin lever has a clear, accountable owner, even if execution requires a cross function collaboration, someone who will actually hold everyone accountable and drive the change. For example, if the returns may really involve around e-commerce, merchandising, quality production, and customer experience, but someone still has to own the reducing of the every in this reduction of that strategy, right? There somebody has to own it. And every inventory health may evolve, the planning and merchandising and sourcing and financial teams, but someone still has to own the target outcome. Freight modeling may involve sourcing, financial, and operations, but someone has to own the model itself. If the ownership is a blur and improvement slows down, if the ownership is clear, the action actually starts to accelerate. This is where the RACI charts are so helpful to really identify who is the responsible party, who is the accountable party, who it needs to be involved and notified at any given point of whatever those problems happens or identified. This is why we always say that the margin recovery is really not a motivational issue. It's often is really has to do with management architecture issue. Because once the ownership is clear, people begin to operate differently. Meetings become sharper, decisions become faster, follow ups through improvements happen more rigorously, and cross functional frictions become easier to resolve. This is where the Kaizen method of solving a problem or addressing some of those problems is super helpful and actually productive. Because when we are bringing the decision makers as well as the process owners, as well as people who are going to be accountable for that particular issue or that particular leak, we are able to then create the actual actionable items of how to address a particular problem and solve for it before we move on to solving the next one. And try not to jumble all of them in one Kaizen. We use one Kaizen for one problem at a time, for one root cause of a problem at a time. Or first, maybe we use that to identify the root cause and then figure out how we were going to solve it. And so if this step you really are defining, right, as you're creating an ownership, who is going to be accountable? What exactly are they going to own? And what outcome are they responsible for? What is the timeline that they're working against? And what decisions are within their control? If you're putting someone accountable, but yet taking all the decision-making power out of them, where they still have to go through 5 different people to get things approved, well, are you really making them a true accountable owner of this particular problem? This is an escalation where really the path exists, in where instead of creating more barriers, you need to be able to open up the opportunities for this particular person to own it and solve for by giving them the rights to decision making. Because ownership without decision rights is really a fake ownership if you think about it. And it happens more than we think. We see this very often happen across a lot of our clients who are coming in. And when we start diving in into the how they've addressed this problem in the past, we really identify often that there was really no one who really owned it. Or if the people who did own it or were expected to be accountable for it, they didn't have the full decision power making. And they constantly still relied on others to reply or giving them the okay, which a lot of the time it would get stuck in the process and it just get lost. No wonder it never really got addressed. And the most important piece, once we actually starting to have the established the ownership, we're starting to solve it, is to be able to track it. And the tracking itself is a discipline that needs to be embedded within your organizational culture. Because if you do not track your recovery, you do not really actually know whether the business has improved. You just know what people are busy doing and they're actually trying to fix something. But are they busy? Being busy is really not the same as building the healthier business. So tracking is what really closes the loop itself. And then creating control points to then ensure that it actually stays in control of whatever the fix was implemented. And if it doesn't, it starts to go out of the control, then immediately people need to be notified to be able to readdress it and see where the process starts to break. It tells you whether your interventions are really working when you starting to measure. It also tells you whether the leaks are actually starting to shrink. And it tells you where the margin recovery you expected is actually showing up in numbers. And sometimes you might actually roll out a small pilot and then measure it on a smaller scale to see if there is even a trajectory for it to work and improve the way you anticipated before you roll out a huge implementation. So if 6 months later they feel like they've worked hard, but they cannot clarify the or clearly pinpoint the dollars that were actually recovered or improved, turnovers or reduced returns or better cash efficiency and actually quantify it, then has it really been a transformation? It's really just then was an activity for them to do, but they really didn't transform anything. So the real roadmap really tracks outcomes that matter financial and operationally. And this will include things like margin improvements by category or SKU level, looking at inventory return improvements. Sell-through improvement is another critical piece, an area where you could look into. Markdown reductions, return rate reductions for by root cause, cash release from the inventory, lead time improvements, landed cost accuracy, and supplier performance consistency. And what you track really depends on the issue you're solving. If your focusing is really on the freight and duty modeling, you track landed cost accuracy and the margin variances. If you're focusing on the MOQ restructuring, you track inventory exposure, markdown pressures, and working capital release. And if you're focusing on returns, you track reductions by the driver, not just the total return rate. So this is really where the real goal is, not just to solve one problem, but building a company that becomes better at seeing and measuring the correcting margin leakages before it gets expensive. That is when the business starts acting like an really an advanced operator and a company that is really trajecting to build a foundation for growth. You're not becoming reactive at that point. You're not becoming and you're trying to solve symptoms. You are really are or trying to always catch the problems in too late. You really become more strategic and becoming a strongly structurally so that you could be able to identify this problems that potentially arise. Problems will always arise. There will always be something that eroding your margin. The key is to learn how to identify it and how to solve it at the root cause, and how to build a team around it that have ownership and actually able to prioritize it and quantify it before they actually start solving it. So when you put these 4 steps together, this is where the real margin recovery roadmap really looks like. Like, just to recover, to summarize, we first want to quantify the leak in dollars. Then we want to prioritize based on the impact and leverage. And then you want to assign a real ownership to a team or to a person. And finally, you track recovery so improvements become measurable and repeatable. This is how you move from we know where the problem is to where we're systematically recovering our profit. And that shift really matters, because the company that improves margin consistently are not the ones that the best at in really intentions, right? Those are the ones who are truly being strategic about what they're working on. And those are the ones that are best, have the best operating disciplines. And that is exactly what this process is designed to really create. So I really hope that we were able to bring value and spark up some ideas and thoughts on how you can address and or identify profit leaks on your end. If you would like to have a free diagnostic with us, feel free to book a call. We'll have a link in the comments as well to directly to my calendar. I'd love to meet with you and have a conversation about your business and current challenges, so that we could be able to help and find the solutions together. And here are really some couple of takeaways. Your margin is not slipping because of your one mistake. It's slipping because of how the business really is structured. And this is the moment where most companies make critical decisions. They either keep tracking the symptom or reacting to the symptoms, or they step back and redesign the system behind the product itself. Because the truth is, growth without a system becomes very expensive, especially in the long run. And the companies that win this industry, they really don't just operate on the best ideas. They operate on quantifiable, measuring, measurable goals, and measure and understanding where the leaks are actually are coming in into what numbers on their P&L. And if you are at the stage where you're really starting to see the margin pressure, the inventory strain, or operational complexity, that usually is a signal that you are outgrown your current system. This is really, if it really resonates, I'd love for you to drop a comment below. What is, and help me answer one question. What is one area where you feel margin might be slipping right now? And where, if you would like, kind of want to restructure, where would you really wanted to focus that restructure? If you are interested in our revenue stabilizing diagnostics, again, let us know in the comments. We would gladly schedule it with you. I'd love to just leave us with a thought in mind, where we do have next roundtable coming up, which is going to be April 7th at 11:30 a.m. You could register on our company page on LinkedIn. Or you can also be, and what we're going to be talking about is actually a stepping stone from what we've discussed today, of how do we move from push to pull supply chain, and how does the fashion and retail leaders reduce their risk and increase their speed. And our next path to profit in April are going to be really talking about how do we build and focus on building a much more resilient supply chain, and more agile supply chain. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone. Please do share this with anyone who you think would be benefiting from it. Would love to touch as many business owners, as many businesses to help them succeed. And I look forward to see you in our next Path to Profit, which is going to be on talking about how to build more agile supply chain. So please do register and reserve that on your calendars. Thank you very much.